this topic area specifically around the growing tropicals, and you'll see this, I'll identify it as we go through. Some of this stuff is just like wildly experimental, and I've never I wouldn't say a million years, I wouldn't currently recommend a farmer to engage with some of these crops, because I don't think they're agronomically feasible for this area, or there's some inherent challenges, and they're not currently working. And that's in some ways the work of the Utopian Seed Project, is to get to a point where we can find out if these crops can or do work in this region, and then offer that information on planting materials to farmers to then be successful growing it. There's other crops that we've grown and we're like, oh my gosh, why isn't everybody already growing taro or chayote? It's easy to grow and it passes all the bars. And they're the ones that we're actively encouraging farmers to start growing and trying to get into the food system. So there's this whole spectrum that we work on. And I always like speaking to gardeners, because I feel like gardeners, they don't necessarily have like a bottom line that they're dealing with, and are more open or have the luxury or privilege to engage with the more experimental stuff. Like, we set ourselves up as a non-profit because we wanted to have the luxury to fail, and we knew that if we set ourselves up as a for-profit farm, then we wouldn't have that luxury. And I'm not saying that gardeners want to go out there and fail, and I'm not suggesting we intentionally fail, but certainly that kind of like open-minded curiosity that gardeners have, and willing to try something new, even if it's just a couple of plants in the corner of a bed, that's the type of work that I really think we need more of, so that we can do that grassroots level, community science style exploration, and then from there we can like feed that into the farm system and start diversifying what we're up to. Okay, so I don't want to get ahead of myself, so I'm going to jump into this, I think. Okay, so I've already started talking about diversifying the food system and all that kind of stuff. I just want to lay the groundwork why I and the Utopian Seed Project think that's important. So we've got a couple of grounding quotes. This isn't just me or the Utopian Seed Project making things up. And I'll read them out to you, because I think they're pretty important. Diversity in food production can be considered on three levels. A, genetic diversity as reflected in the range of cultivars which can be selected for production. B, species diversity captured through production of a wide range of crops on each farm. And C, broad ecosystem diversity described by the diversity of production between farms and within the broader food system. So this was a paper written by a professor who was based in North Carolina, talking about resilient food systems in North Carolina, so it's very local specific. And really what she's looking at is growing the food crops. There's obviously lots of other elements of diversity, and if we broadly define agrobiodiversity, then that includes the people in those systems, it includes the animals in those systems, it includes the microbiology in the soil. She's specifically talking about what it is we're actually growing. And the focus of this one is B, it's species diversity. We're looking at trying to grow more types of crops in our food system. The first one is really just varietal diversity, like can we grow more varieties of things? And while the Utopian Seed Project does a lot of variety trials and variety exploration, that's not the focus of this particular class. And then there's another level here that I think is worth referencing, but isn't reflected in this specific quote. There's also genetic diversity, because we can grow a lot of different varieties, but if they're all kind of more or less the same, then it doesn't really represent diversity. But within those varieties, we can also explore like real broad genetics. And we're always looking at this question of diversity, because diversity is kind of a pillar of resilience, and we're looking for resilient food systems that can withstand externalized impacts or supply chain shocks or extreme weather events, and still continue to produce food in those challenging conditions. So we're looking for resilience, and we can get there through diversity. Okay, so next one. This is a real big, was for me, an eye-opening quote. The range of crops grown across the globe is severely limited. According to the FAO's State of the World's Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture, there are 20,000 edible plants, 6,000 of which have historically been used for food. And in 2019, fewer than 200 made a major contribution to food production, and only 9 of those were used for 2/3 of all food production. There's a lot of numbers there, but the summary is we have like food system potential in the thousands of species, like 6,000 edible species have been used for food production in the course of human history. And even that's a small number, that's only 25% of all the potential species out there that could be used for food production. But in 2019, only 9 of those species were used for 2/3 of all food production. So that's just like this massive difference from where we're currently at and what we currently have access to as food consumers versus like the potential that the food system could offer if we embrace a little bit more of this diversity. And there's a lot of like resilience and climate related things that are important here, but I think just on a very base visceral level, I just think it's sad that we walk into a supermarket in Asheville and see, you know, I guess the Cavendish banana is like one of our best examples where like it's a multi-billion-dollar industry and it all relies on one single cloned homogeneous banana, like across the entire world. And yet, if you look at banana diversity, there's just like beautiful small pink ones and big blue ones and fruity ones and ones that taste all different types of fruit flavors. And what we have access to as consumers is one single genetically cloned banana. And I'm like, I want to eat all the bananas. I want to try all those different flavors. I want to enjoy that diversity. And the banana is an extreme example, but really we see that reflected throughout crops. The broccoli that I buy and purchase in Ingalls down the road is pretty much identical to what you're going to see in California and the Pacific Northwest. And like the supermarket industrial agriculture is based on monoculture, very, very narrow diversity. And on this very personal level, I just don't think that's fair. I want to see all that beautiful diversity. I want to experience it. I want to enjoy it. Food is fun. Food is delicious. Food is good for us. Food is cultural. And yeah, I feel like we should have a right to access that diversity. There's this awesome side benefit of that in that if we also incorporate diversity into our food and farming systems, then those systems are more resilient, and that's a good thing as well.
Hold on. What is that?
Good question. That is the same as this. We will get to it.
All right, cool.
Does anybody know?
Ube.
Ube. Oh, you're not allowed to answer questions. You've been here before. This is ube, which is an example of a true yam. So, like an actual yam, not a sweet potato. So Dioscorea alata, there's a few different edible yam species, and it grows these big, large underground roots. This was also grown in Western North Carolina, and yeah, we'll dig into it a little bit deeper later.
Thank you.
No pun intended.
Okay, next one. This is National Geographic wrote an article about this food policy research. The International Food Policy Research Institute projects that by 2050, suitable croplands for 4 top commodities, corn, potatoes, rice, and wheat, will shift, in some cases pushing farmers to plant new crops. It is reasonable to assume that we will see similar shifts for other market crops. The article concludes that the winners, researchers say, will be farmers who modernize their methods and diversify their fields. And so what this is beginning to acknowledge is that we are experiencing climate change, the environment is shifting in terms of our growing conditions, and it would behoove us to shift our food production with the climate. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves in a place, and actually if I'm being I'm generally optimistic, but what I think will likely happen is that we'll dig our heels in and try and keep the status quo and have the existing systems continue to exist for as long as possible. And the way that we're going to do that is by trying to modify the environment to suit these crops. And the way we've traditionally modified the environment is through herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, greenhouse, plastic, and all these like non-environmentally friendly externalized inputs to try and make what we want to grow irregardless of the environment. And what I would like to suggest is that we could embrace a paradigm shift where instead of trying to modify the environment to suit the crops, we could change the crops to suit the environment. And we already have plenty of food production happening in tropical conditions, and as the climate warms, as the pests and diseases from the south migrate north, then we can adopt some more southern practices into our current conditions to be able to grow in this different climate. So that's the concept there is the winners are going to be the farmers who modernize their methods and diversify the field. So diversity is key. And then I think this might be the last quote. Climate change is an increasing threat to growing food, with severe weather events causing more regular farm and crop devastation in the south. In addition, a warming climate will leave some conventional crops less viable and fuel greater disease and pest pressure. So that was an article by the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is pretty much saying the same thing. And these are big organizations. So that, again, this isn't me saying this is like recognized on a national, international scale. Somebody told me recently that McDonald's was beginning to look into taro production because they're recognizing that it's going to become less cost effective to grow and source potatoes. So these types of things, if they're happening on that scale, then maybe as people interested in local food systems, we should also be thinking about diversity and change.
Just a quick question, the south, that means the country south of the equator? Do you know?
It's a good question. I don't actually know. I don't know what that means.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll have to pull up the article and see if that's talking about America or the world.
Okay.
But the same thing applies whichever.
Yeah.
Okay, so to get into the specifics a little bit, then I want to ground us in what we're actually talking about. So the presentation is called Growing Tropical Perennials as Temperate Annuals. And so this idea of a tropical perennial isn't new, and actually in our current food system has like a real solid history for us to like draw up on some experiences. And so let me just lead with an example. Do people recognize what that is?
Sweet potatoes or yams?
Sweet potatoes. Yeah, definitely sweet potatoes. And so we all, I mean, how many people have grown sweet potatoes? A lot of people in this region grow sweet potatoes. We treat it as an annual, like around about now, or if not a couple of weeks ago, we'll be taking our little sweet potatoes and we'll start sprouting them out. And then, or maybe we wait for the seed companies to start selling slips. And somebody else is sprouting them out, and then we come along and we cut this little sprout and we take it and we put it in the ground, and then that grows into a sweet potato plant. If you have enough of them, you get a sweet potato field. And then from that plant, you grow more sweet potatoes, and we harvest them in the fall, and then we store them. So effectively, that's a description of an annual production system. We're starting in the spring, we're growing them through the summer, we're harvesting them in the fall. We're growing sweet potatoes as annuals in our temperate region. But if we go back long enough, the origin of sweet potatoes is tropical, and in tropical regions, sweet potatoes have a different growth cycle. They will vine out like this, much the same, but then every single node on a sweet potato vine has the potential to root. You might have seen this when you've grown sweet potatoes, that if you let it just vine through the field, it'll actually start rooting down. And if your season is long enough, each of those roots will actually grow a sweet potato. So instead of us being in an annual condition where we're digging up that central cluster of sweet potatoes and maybe trying to stop them rooting so they can put all their energy into that central production, in perennial production systems, they will vine and root and vine and root, and you get perennial production where the vines don't actually die back to the ground. So sweet potatoes are a perfect example of a tropical perennial that has already crossed the boundary. Like, I don't need to convince anybody to do this. You're already growing tropical perennials as temperate annuals. It's just happened for so long that we don't even think of them as tropical perennials. They're just, to us, temperate annuals. To the point now that they can grow these all the way up into, Maine. They have production techniques where they'll put down black plastic and warm the soil early and use short season varieties and all these techniques that were actually growing them in really quite cold conditions. They've traveled a long, long, long way from their origins. So plants are very adaptable, and if we work with them over time, then they can continue to change to the conditions that we want them to grow in. So that's sweet potatoes. If you're not seeing them sprout before, I can pass that around if you're interested. This is also a good example if anyone is is interested in slipping sweet potatoes, often they say use the smaller pieces because they'll produce as many slips as the big pieces. So you can save the big pieces for eating, and slipping out a big piece won't give you more slips than slipping out a small piece. And this is a perfect example of that. This tiny little potato is throwing out like tons and tons and tons of slips. And then we could have eaten the big ones. Okay, so sweet potato is my clearest example, and actually the person that I want to acknowledge is someone called Jana Fishman. She's on the board of the Utopian Seed Project. She's been working with sweet potatoes for decades. This is a picture of her farm in Old Fort. She creates like over 100 different varieties of sweet potatoes. It's really amazing. And she's got a lot of connections in Florida, and she had friends that started sending her up material from Florida, and she ended up with other tropical material like taro and cassava and some of these other things we're going to talk about. And because she was like just so well researched and versed in growing sweet potatoes, she's the one that was like, she just basically applies her sweet potato knowledge to all these other tropicals, and then over multiple years kind of tweaks it. She's like, oh, well, it worked a little bit if I started like this, or if I started it in moist conditions, it sprouted a little bit quicker, or if it was hot or cold or dark. And she just like tweaks the technique that she learned on sweet potatoes to kind of like learn how to grow these other tropical perennials as temperate annuals. So we're just in many ways continuing the work of Jana and working with Jana to work out how to grow all these things. Most of the time we find out they can grow just with these minor tweaks. And that's a lot of what we're going to go through with some of these crop examples. Some more of Jana's sweet potatoes. And again, like this is just a diversity picture. So each of these are different varieties of sweet potatoes. You can't see it in this picture because it's just the flesh color, but you get different flesh color, you get different skin color, and they're different combinations, but then you get different binding habitats, and you get different leaf shapes and different leaf colors, and all those different recombinations give a whole range of varieties that are fun to explore. You're seeing this in real time with this little sweet potato. Okay, so what I want to get into is the roots, and I'll head off an early question. A lot of what we're going to talk about are root crops, and this isn't specifically a root crop discussion. I want to keep it like tropical perennial discussion, but it just happens that most of the material that we're working with ends up being root crop material, and the primary reason for that is because in tropical conditions where you can grow year round, then the technique tends to be harvest and plant at more or less the same time. So for example, if people are growing cassava in the tropics, cassava grows on these long, like you get this kind of central stem, and then you get lots of leaves coming off, and the plants are pretty big, and then the cassava root is all underground. But the propagation material for cassava is a stem cutting. So you just cut a bit of stem, and you stick that in the ground, and it sprouts. You get a root, you get a new shoot, and then that grows more cassava. So that's how you propagate cassava. So in the tropics, what tends to happen is they go in, they dig all the cassava. In the same day, sometimes they'll just hack off a chunk of that stick and stick it in the ground again. So from harvest to planting is like almost zero. In Hawaii, they do the same with taro. They'll harvest the taro. Actually, I don't have a good example of taro. Pretend this is taro. It's very close. So they'll harvest the taro. They'll chop off the top, which is where you'll get the bud and it'll sprout into a new plant. They'll eat the bottom section and plant the top section all at the same time. So it's just like this ongoing cycle of production. If we were to try that here, we would chop off the top, put it in the ground in November, and a week later it would freeze and everything would die and we'd have no more taro, right? We don't have those tropical conditions. So our primary challenge, I would say, in growing these crops is to work out how to carry propagation material from one season to the next.
Yes.
Growing them is really quite easy. I believe for it to be a sustainable food system, we need to be able to propagate our own planting material. Like we could just always go back to Hawaii and always buy in new stuff. I don't think that's very sustainable. So how do we carry over our own propagation material? That becomes the biggest question and the biggest challenge that we've faced. And we'll do some specifics there once we get into specific crops. But what I want to do is kind of give you... Oh, sorry, I know why I started saying that. Wondering. So that challenge of carrying propagation material from one season to the next, sometimes 3-4 months at a time, the plants that produce a storage root are the ones that are easiest to do that with. So when you look at all the tropicals that we're working with, 80-90% of them are root crops, and the root is literally a storage mechanism. That's its job. So we've had way more success saving taro roots and turmeric roots and arrowroots and all these other root crops because they're designed to store, and we just need to give them the right conditions, than we have with stem cuttings or tropical plants that never produce a seed and those types of things. So that's the reason most of these are roots, is because the root is the most natural storage mechanism, and we're just leaning into that. I would love to work with other things, but currently they're just, the challenges are too big for us to get past. Yeah.
There's a question about this chaya
Yes.
spinach tree. Have you been able to overwinter cuttings of it? Is
Yeah,
it
yeah.
fairly doable? Because I picked up some off Etsy and I'm experimenting.
Yeah. Chaya. We'll talk about chaya, and chaya is one of the more easier ones to overwinter as stem cuttings.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll come back around to that one. Okay, so let me give you the general seasonal overview of how we treat most of these tropicals, and then we'll do nuanced stuff as we get into each crop. So where are we now? We're it's April now, so we're kind of in a transition phase where we're getting the crops from storage and getting them ready for planting. So let's pretend we're 2 months ago and the crops are still in storage. So when we get them in storage, we're aiming to keep them dormant. That's our whole plan. If we can keep them dormant for as long as possible, we put them to bed basically, then they hopefully don't rot in the basement or don't start growing prematurely and all these other things. We want to keep them quiet. You can think of storing either your sweet potatoes or your Irish potatoes. You can store them over the winter if you give them the right storage conditions. So they're in storage. And then once we get to kind of February or March, then that's when we start thinking we need to wake these up. We need to start getting them ready for planting. Sometimes they're way too excited and they're already awake, and you go into your basement and there's a vine growing all over the place. So chayote is a good example of that. Chayote is really hard to keep dormant. It just wants to sprout. But other things, let me pass one of these around. I'm going to pass this little root around, and I want you just to look at this little section here and this little section here. These are the buds on the rhizome that are getting ready to sprout. So when it's dormant, then those buds, sometimes you can't even really see where they are. But as we bring them into slightly warmer, slightly more humid conditions, then those buds begin to swell. So we have this period where we're not really planting them, we're just changing their environment. Usually for me, that's taking them out of the basement, which is cool and humid, and putting them in my shed, which at this time of the year is pretty warm. And they literally wake up, they're waking up for the spring, the buds start swelling, and we know they're getting ready to sprout. So all of them go through a waking up phase. Some of them are very simple and predictable, like turmeric. You give it heat and humidity, it's going to start budding and then sprouting. This one, I think of this one as the cat of the vegetable world. It does what the hell it wants, and we really haven't worked out what the trigger is for its sprouting. And actually, Yarna and I go back and forth on this. She called me up just a week ago and she said, "I think I've worked out how to sprout the ube." She said, "Keep it really dry. It doesn't want to be wet, and it'll sprout quicker." And I was like, "That's so strange," because I did an event a couple of months ago with the same class, and I brought this same tuber with me, and I put it in a plastic bag to bring it home, put it in the corner of my house. My life's generally chaotic, and I forgot about it. And then just a couple of weeks ago, I found it again, And so it had been in this bag, and when I opened the bag, it was kind of smelly and wet and humid, and I was like, oh, but it was like sprouting out of the bag. So it loved those wet, humid conditions. And all my other ube has little bits like this, that tiny little sprout there. I'll pass this around so you can see. So it's just beginning to wake up. That's been in the dry conditions that Jana thought she'd nailed it. My one that I left in a nasty humid bag in the corner was just going for it. So we still have no idea what the specific trigger for sprouting is. I'll pass it around. So ube was still working out. Turmeric's fairly easy. Taro's fairly easy. So, we're working out those triggers. But there's always a trigger to wake it up. So wake up phase, and then once we start seeing that bud swelling or that initial sprouting, then our aim is to time that for planting time. So all of these are frost sensitive, they're tropicals. So if they are outside and they have above ground growth and we get a frost, they're gonna die. So that's not good. So we're kind of faced with these two planting options. So we get to this kind of like March, April time, and we need to make a decision. One of the decisions is if we have a piece of planting material that's just budding out a little bit, so we know it's kind of woken up, but doesn't have a lot of top growth on it. We found that we can actually go out and plant it like deep in the soil. So even though there's going to be above ground frosts, we can plant it fairly deep, 6 to 8 inches down. We've done this with turmeric, we've done it with taro, we've done it with chayote, we've done it with yacon. You can go in, even if it's literally freezing outside, plant it deep under the soil, and then just remember where you planted it, because you won't see anything for at least 2 months. And what happens is sometime towards the end of May or beginning of June, it sprouts up then. And I kind of like this planting tactic because one, the longer you store it, the more likely you are to lose it. So if you're trying to keep it in perfect conditions for an extra 2 months, it might rot out on you. But if it's in the ground, it's where it wants to be. 2, March is for us generally a quieter time in the field. Once we get to May, then everything wants to go in the ground in May. So if I can get something in the ground in March, I'm happy to do that. And then also, and we haven't done the side-by-side trials to prove this yet, but there's kind of a working theory that by having it in the ground for longer, it's got an extra couple of months to do root development. And even though it's much slower to emerge out the ground, once it does, it's kind of ready to go. Good root development, no transplant shock, conditions are right, and it grows really well. So the times that we've been organized enough to do this early planting technique has really worked well for us. We've also modified this technique where we've done a row of this in like as early as the beginning of March and then put black landscaping fabric over it, so we get that additional warming effect of the soil. And then once it gets to like mid-May, we pull back that fabric. So then we have a weed-free bed because it's had fabric on top. The soil's nice and warm because it's had the black fabric on top. And then the root is just ready to jump up and grow. And they've been very successful years, although again, I've not done side-by-side trials to kind of really show the data on that. That tactic is totally viable. We've more or less missed that window now because we're only a couple of weeks away from last frost. So the other tactic, and what you see more in farm systems happening, is people will start these more like on a tomato schedule and just treat them like a transplant. So you could, this is arrowroot, which I'll talk about more later, but you could just take this and put it in a pot and keep it somewhere warm, maybe on a heat mat inside, protected like you do your tomato and your pepper and your eggplant seedlings, and it would spread out in those conditions, and you get a little baby plant on top. And then once we're after danger of frost, you could just treat it like a tomato transplant and get it out in the ground, do all the things you'll do for a successful transplant, and do it like that. And we've done both tactics. Both are totally effective. There's a much higher management component, obviously, if you've got like a flat full of all these taro plants and you've got to keep them alive and then transplant them all, and so space and all that sort of stuff. That's why I prefer the planting the root once it's woken up stage, as opposed to having a whole amount of growth on it. So that's the two general options for planting these tropicals. So then they're in the ground. Most of them like full sun. They like the heat. They're tropical plants, obviously, and they'll grow throughout the summer. In terms of irrigation, most of them, this is generally true of root crops. Root crops can survive low rain conditions because they've kind of got that roots to fall back on. That's kind of helps them weather any prolonged dry periods. However, during those prolonged dry periods, they'll be in survival mode and not growing mode. So it's kind of like drought tolerant but not drought productive. So that's a personal choice on whether you want to irrigate or water, but if it's a long dry spell, you could just have them as a survival crop in the corner and forget about them the whole season. That totally works. But if you want your best production, then regular watering will help them be productive. And then, as a general rule, most of these crops want a longer growing season than we can offer them. So our frost-free days are shorter than any literature you'll read coming out of the tropics that says what these want. So cassava wants like 9 months plus. Taro, you'll rarely see less than 6 months growing season, and we literally don't have that. So our current tactic for the last couple of years has just been to give them as much growing time as possible. Them in as soon as we can, and we just leave them for as long as possible. So whenever that first frost comes is when we harvest them. That's been our tactic to date. We're beginning to modify that mindset a little bit because there's a question around what does that extra month get you? And this is probably more of a farmer consideration than a gardener consideration, but if you're not harvesting your bed of taro until the end of October when we've had this late frost, then you pretty much, there's not a lot you could follow taro with at that point. There's a few things, you can still get garlic in and a few other things, but you're pretty much riding off that bed with a super, super late harvest. Sometimes it even gets too late to even really establish a successful cover crop. But if you could harvest that like the end of September, then you've still got options for a full crop to follow the taro. And so we've got this question of like, how much extra yield does that extra month buy you? If it's like doubles the yield in that last month, then go for it, leave it as long as possible. But if you're only getting 10% extra yield for a whole month in the ground and you're losing a succession crop opportunity, then I feel like my recommendation would be harvest earlier, sacrifice the 10% and get in a high value cash crop, like a full green or whatever.
Is there ever any season extension for the taro, or are you trying to go with minimal input? So
that's a good question. For us at the moment, we're trying to grow all of the tropicals in open field, non-season extension environment. We'll talk about turmeric in a little bit, where a lot of people grow that in high tunnel environment. Turmeric's a little bit of a strange one because it's a high value crop, so I think it can justify that greenhouse space. A lot of these crops we're working with are like staple crops, and we want to grow them in a way that they could be grown and sold as a staple crop in this region. And so I'm not interested in growing taro in greenhouse, although I'm sure your yields would increase if you had that extra month on it.
Due to adaptation, because over time, over time it'll adapt ideally by leaving it out.
Yes, it's another good question, and I'll cover it a little bit later as well. But all of these crops are replicated by clonal division, so there's no actual genetic change from year to year unless we see a random mutation, as opposed to seeds, where the seeds are always sharing pollen and genetically changing. And so in a sexual reproduction seed world, we can see quite rapid adaptation over time because we're recombining genetics all the time. With clones, like when I chop off this growing point and plant it, then it's like that plant is genetically identical to the plant I grew last year. And so you see less rapid change over time. There is a whole world of epigenetics, which epigenetics are slowly being shown to be almost as important as genetics and can lead to adaptation over time, and epigenetics can be inherited over time. So we don't need to go too deep into that, but there can be regional adaptation with clonally propagated plants. That's the takeaway. It just doesn't happen as quickly. So we've planted, we've grown, we've got all the way to the end of the season. Hopefully we've got a good yield under the ground. Most of these are root crops, so we go ahead and dig them. And then at that point, generally, there's some kind of curing stage. And again, the sweet potato growers will know this. You dig your sweet potatoes and they need to be warm and humid for a period of time to convert the starches to sugars and store well. So most of these have some period where we leave them just to kind of dry out a little bit and chill in warm areas. And then most of them we convert to kind of like, most of them seem to store well in potato-like conditions. So we're talking humidity, relatively high humidity and cool conditions. And for me, that's my basement, and they seem to do well down there. We try different things. A lot of the time they like being packed in leaves or sawdust or sometimes even sand, and that can hold in the humidity. The thing that seems to take these crops out the quickest is if it's dry, and then they kind of shrivel and rot pretty quickly. But if you can keep that humidity pretty high, then they're quite happy over the winter period. And then you store them for as long as possible. It's worth keeping an eye on them because we always lose a certain percentage of them. They will rot out, so we pull out the rotten ones throughout the season, and then we're still left with planting stock once we get to that wake-up period, and we're back to February, March, where we're waking them up again, and then either planting, transplanting, summer, and we're on that cycle. And I do think this should be a cyclical thing and not just a linear, always import new planting stock. So that's the big overview, which you can apply, like as you're starting benchmark, what am I going to do? That's where you go, and then just teasing out the nuanced, this is a little bit different here, is where we go from that point. But how many people are growing turmeric? Usually it's quite a lot in this area. Turmeric's kind of a fun one because it's, in my mind, it's almost, no, I lost it there. In my mind, turmeric is kind of like very close to the sweet potato world. It's like, it's almost already crossed over that boundary. But if you go back 10, 15, 20 years, very few people were growing turmeric in this region. It's a very recent thing. And I even, like when I first came to America about 10 years ago, like the first conferences, like going to like a turmeric growing conference was like the extreme crazy people were going to that. Like, no, and now people are making a lot of money off growing turmeric in this region. There's some big scale growers working with it. So turmeric is like, we're kind of in the midst of it with turmeric, which is really interesting and exciting to see that even though it's totally a tropical perennial, people are already beginning to think of it as a temperate annual, and people are pretty well acquainted with it. So apply your sweet potato knowledge, apply your turmeric knowledge to all of these crops. One of the reasons I like, I'm not going to do too much on turmeric, but one of the reasons I do like to talk about it is represented on this plate right here. What I feel might have happened, even though turmeric's a good example of this region embracing crop diversity, right? We're bringing in this new crop that we can grow, turmeric. We've pretty quickly fallen into a trap of kind of a monoculture within that world of turmeric. So most folks that I know, certainly farmer level, are like buying their turmeric from a single source in Hawaii. I can't show you this without it falling off, so I'm just going to pass it around, and you can just see some of this turmeric diversity. So yeah, most people are basically sourcing from a single source, growing it in the same way, and every year they're going back to that same source in Hawaii. There's pockets of people that are saving their own turmeric, and slowly people are starting to explore varietal diversity, but it's kind of just, turmeric's my warning here that crop diversity is good, we've got turmeric, but like the next step, like straight away should be that, well now let's look at varietal diversity. Because when you get to turmeric, there's not just like a lot of different varieties of turmeric, there's hundreds of different species of turmeric. So the potential for diversity within turmeric is amazing. I kind of have this sense that we're already leaning into the Cavendish banana world, where everyone's just growing one or two varieties of turmeric. And in reality, we should and could be leaning into the other world. And on this plate, you're seeing green turmeric, black turmeric, blue turmeric, white mango turmeric, red turmeric, and yellow turmeric. And again, that's just like barely scratching the surface of what's available in the world of turmeric. So they've got different flavor profiles, they've got different medicinal compounds, they've got different growing habitats. not they all grow more or less the same, but different leaf colors and structures coming out. And so just to continue to explore that diversity, I think is really important. The Utopian Seed Project is trying to get more agrobiodiversity into the food and farm system, and that's actually an easy thing to say and a really hard thing to do. And part of that is supply chain challenges. We find it pretty easy to persuade chefs to try something new, but as soon as they eat something and enjoy it, they're like, okay, how can I get 20 pounds of this every week to put on my menu? And I'm like, oh, I have no idea how to do that. But then I go to a farmer and say, this is really easy to grow. And so they grow a whole bunch of it, but if no one buys it at the end of the season, then they are also mad at me. So having this whole slowly increasing supply and demand at the same time challenge, while activating all the consumers, and so that's one of that's our work, I feel. And so this supply chain issue is part of that. We've set up an organization called the Appalachian Seed Growers Collective, which is starting to work towards that so that we can experiment in the field and then pass it to the collective that can then grow it and supply it to local farmers. This year they may grow some of the turmeric out, and then we'll have people growing and supplying turmeric. Not many of them are certified organic, so that's an extra layer. But I think this represents opportunities for farmers, because you can sell turmeric at like $20, $30 a pound if it's organic. And you could be selling half-pound and 1 pound bags of planting stock. And I think you could make a lot of money off selling turmeric, and you just can't access some of these colors very easily. So I think there's some pretty big short-term opportunities for farmers to jump in on this, certainly if you're certified organic. But yeah, that's definitely a problem with all of these things, and everyone's going to be like, so how do I get it? How do I grow it? And I'm happy to share what I have, but we don't have enough and we're not set up for production, so we're looking at that next level of how do we have nursery production on these crops to get out to people. Okay. So mainly the turmeric I'm sharing just for the diversity piece, just beautiful different colors and opportunities in there. Yeah, I think I'll leave turmeric at that, because there's lots and lots of resources for growing that around here, so we don't need to go too deep on that one specifically. So the first real one I'm going to jump into is this yacon. I don't have any show and tell with this because it's already kind of all bedded up and getting ready to grow. Anyone grown yacon, Bolivian sunroot? A little bit, Pat? So this is actually I've talked about taro a lot, and that's like one of my main ones we're pushing. The almost equal with that is yacon. I think this is one that there's no reason why everybody in Western North Carolina shouldn't know about this, shouldn't be eating and enjoying it. Farmers should be making good money off selling it. Like it's just ready to go. So let's dig into yacon a little bit. One, it's in the sunflower family, so it kind of, I've got a picture of the plant. In the wrong order. That's the plants. You can kind of think like dahlia, Jerusalem artichoke kind of world here. Certainly in this kind of erect plant structure, it doesn't get too tall, has beautiful little yellow flowers that look like miniature sunflowers. So grows very easily. We plant it at about 12-inch spacing. I think if we had a longer season, more tropical, then the plants get big enough and shrubby enough that you could give them a little more spacing. So sometimes people that are more Piedmont, Eastern North Carolina, I might recommend 18 to 24-inch spacing. For us, we're more 12 to 18-inch spacing on these plants. And then to back it up, the kind of the cool thing with this is that let me find the right picture for this. Okay, so this is what we pull out the ground at harvest time. So this is kind of November time. And what you're seeing is this big storage tuber here, which is what you eat. And then hidden, you can kind of see it here, this little red thing here. This is a little alien looking thing that we call a propagule. So, and again, like kind of, if you've grown dahlias, think dahlias here, you get around that central crown of the dahlias, you get the budding point where you get the little sprout coming out that probably looks a little bit like that sprout. The difference with yacon is they're just a little bit more bulbous, and you get a bunch of them growing around that central crown. And then you get all those storage tubers coming out like the dahlia tubers. That whole storage tuber will never grow. So if I cut this up here and planted that, it's got no growth points, it would never grow. So that whole thing is food. So that's a kind of a cool thing with this plant is with the taro, I'm deciding to plant this or I'm deciding to eat it. It's one or the other. Whereas with yacon, it's like it produces all these storage tubers, which is delicious food, and then on the inside you get those little propagules, which is what you plant, you save and you plant. So it's really good for that purpose. To try and kind of describe how this tastes, actually you can go back to the English term, they called it ground apple when they came across it. So it grows underground and it's got the texture and the sweetness of an apple. So you can eat this raw, you can bite into it, and it's super crunchy, it's juicy, and it's sweet. And it's just amazing. Generally you would peel it, the skin has a little bit of bitter overtones. The ways you see it turning up in industry is it's so juicy that you can actually juice this whole thing and get yacon juice off it, and then you can boil that down into a syrup like you would maple syrup or sorghum syrup. And you get this real thick, dark, like molasses-like syrup from it, which is just like really, really, like it's kind of minerally in a good way and super sweet, and you basically would use it like honey or blackstrap molasses type thing. And so yeah, absolutely delicious to grow, relatively productive in terms of like what you get out of the ground. And actually we do all these chef events, and whenever chefs see fresh water chestnuts on my list that I give them out, like they're always really excited. They're like, yes, I'll take the water chestnuts. And after the first few chefs took like 3 pounds of water chestnuts from me, the feedback I got off them was, I love the water chestnuts, but they were like the biggest pain in the ass to peel. Like they were like, never give me water chestnuts again, unless they had like a sous chef or something. So basically, you got to like these little things. You got to chop off the top. You got to chop off the bottom. You got to use a paring knife around the edge. There's no like quick way to do this, and so it just takes hours and hours to prepare a sizable amount of these water chestnuts for eating. For the longest time, I thought there must we have a lot of water chestnut export. There must be a machine out there to do it. I haven't been able to find a small scale machine, and from what I've read online, this is one of those examples of just like cheap labor and high skill set goes into people just sitting there hand peeling water chestnuts for the water chestnut industry. I'm sure there must be some level of mechanization somewhere, but I've not come across it. And so that's my barrier on water chestnuts. It's not growing them, it's not persuading people to eat them, it's the actual like physical processing of them in a Western economy might not work. This is a little water chestnut flower. We've never had viable seed off them. We always hope for seed production. If we have seed production, we have genetic recombination, we can have more rapid regional adaptation, we've got more options in terms of breeding and adaptation work. So we always want seed production. Most of the time we don't get it on these tropicals. So it's exciting to see a flower, but we just don't know how to seed off them. Varieties, taste testing, that's one of the themes. We're always looking for different varieties, different genetics, different flavor profiles. So we're always doing these taste tests and working with chefs and food consumers. And that's water chestnuts. And we'll see the real plants out there. And again, you're welcome to take one with you if you want to grow water chestnuts.
If I could just ask,
Yes.
isn't it true the elephant ear is not edible? The tubers? What we
Yeah.
mental.
We can jump into that quickly. So again, elephant ear could mean multiple things in terms of like a species. If the elephant ear is Colocasia esculenta, and there's lots of examples of landscaping Araceae plants that are Colocasia esculenta, then they are technically edible. One very important thing to note with all of the taros from the culinary side is that they have a high level of calcium oxalates in them. I say high level, they have calcium oxalates in them at varying levels. Those calcium oxalates are kind of like crystalline structures that if you eat that plant material, whether it's the tuber or the stem or the leaf raw, you'll get like an intense irritation. Pat's experienced this, so maybe he can describe it better, but it's not pleasant in any way, shape or form. You don't want to eat raw. If I bit into this, then I'd be crying in the corner with my sore throat. So that's very important to know that this is a crop that has to be cooked, and cooking neutralizes this problem. And you wouldn't eat potatoes raw without getting sick. So it doesn't need to be a scary thing, just a knowledge thing that you do need to cook it to use it. And so that ties into these landscaping plants, because most of the edible taros that we're working with have presumably had some level of selection done on them, that their palatability is probably quite high because they're used within food cultures. Actually, taro is one of the most ancient food crops. It's been around for over 5,000 years as a domesticated food crop. So I've got to imagine that our ancestors knew what they were doing and have selected these food crops for good reasons. The landscaping taros have unknown levels of edibility. They're not poisonous, and I went through a short period where I was eating random elephant ears because I was curious, and the thing I noticed quite quickly was none of them gave me the calcium. I cooked them really well, so they're all edible, non-poisonous, but when you eat an edible taro, it's got like a creaminess to it, and it's really kind of like a potato-like starchiness. You can do lots of good food things with it. When I started eating like Jack's Giant and some of these landscaping plants, they were just kind of like, it wasn't like no calcium oxalates, but the texture wasn't there. There wasn't like just a real good culinary component that you get when you eat this. So I kind of stopped after a while. Again, trusting to the ancestors to know that they knew what they were doing when they selected it, and the landscaping plants people didn't care about whether you could eat them or not. So technically you eat them if you're really hungry, they just didn't taste very good. That's my summary. So yeah, you can do your own experiment if you choose. So the taro follows the same root cycle, right? So we're planting this in the spring. You can go deep with it, or it can sprout as a transplant and transplant after danger of frost. Grows throughout the season. It's got a fairly erect plant structure, so it's got this central stem that goes up, and then the leaves come out and form these kind of almost frond-like leaves. This is at Yana's house where it gets quite tall. I learned a long time ago that you just don't compare yourself to Yana, it's not worth it, you just end up sad. Like everything grows better at Yana's place. My taro has never got much more than 4 feet tall. But at Yana's, and this is Brandon, and he's tall, so this is 6 feet plus taro. Yana is a little bit warmer than us. She's in Old Fort. She's about 1,300 feet.
I was about to say, this looks like similar to what you would find in the tropics.
Yeah. Yana's place in August is just like walking into a tropical paradise. It's amazing. But it does show you that it does keep an upright structure, which is good. Again, we do 12 to 18 inch spacing. If you're a bit warmer, you might want to go to 24 inch spacing. But I wouldn't go closer than 12 inches, because from this central stem that grows like this, from that little piece that you planted, it'll grow lots of babies up around it. And those babies can sprout as well. So it gets these clusters. And so we end up with this language where we have the mother corm, which is the big central piece, and then you get cormels or eddos growing around the outside. And so big mother in the middle, lots of eddos around the outside. And so if you were too close to each other, they'd all be clustered and they'd get smaller and smaller. So we do 12 to 18 inches, give it the whole season. At the end of the season, usually with taro, we wait until the frost kills the leaves. We go and dig up the whole plant, and it's just like digging potatoes. You just shove your spade or your fork in and lift the whole plant. You get this cluster of the mother and all the things. You break off all the soil and put it in a basket, and that's your harvest. No curing process on taro. You can go ahead and just eat it straight away, so you could dig it and eat it in the same time period. We do let it, for storage, we do let it dry down a little bit, so that if it's moist in the field, we let it dry down. and then we put it into storage. Again, Irish potato-like storage conditions. You don't want it to dry out in storage, otherwise it'll just rot and shrivel really quickly. So kind of like a high level ambient humidity and fairly cool conditions for storage. And then the really interesting thing with taro, and I had this brief conversation in the break, is what we've noticed and lots of other people have noticed is that taro actually overwinters here. So I almost need to stop talking about it as a temperate annual, because it's actually, in my experience, a temperate perennial. I had it overwinter 2 years ago when we hit -1 Fahrenheit at my place, and it still resprouted the next year. So that's pretty cold tolerant to get through that weather event.
Did you have any overwinter, like what was it last year? There were temps in the single digits for like a week.
Yeah. So I've had the same patch now for 4 years, and I've never dug it. I just use it for leaf harvest, and it's come back every year for the last 4 years. So I've treated that bed as a straight up perennial, and so far it just keeps coming back. There must be some time where, like, if it freezes down to 18 inches, it might take out the whole plant, because the observation has been that the colder it is over the winter, the slower it is to come up the following spring. And I think that's because the top does die. It dies to a certain level, but there's still living plant material deep enough down, and it just resprouts from lower ground. It takes longer to emerge, and then it grows and then overwinters again. So it's been pretty interesting.
How deep did you plant this?
So the taro, at this time of year, then yeah, maybe 6 inches would be good enough. If you just want to throw it in the ground, or you could go home and put it in a pot and keep it somewhere warm and let it sprout in the pot and transplant it in like middle to the end of May. So the taro is great in that respect that it will overwinter. The important note here is, like with most root crops, like potatoes will overwinter here for the most part, but you still wouldn't want to treat them as a perennial, because your potatoes will just get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Because one potato grows a cluster of potatoes, and then the next year, every single one of those potatoes wants to grow more potatoes, and you're just really overcrowded. And that's what's going to happen with the taro too, is they'll just, as a root crop, you'll get a whole bunch of little things, and you won't get any good big pieces to eat. So that's why we dig and respace every year, and I'd still advise that as a good practice for the taro, unless you wanted a perennial bed for either backup, emergency type food preparedness ideas, or leaf harvest, which we'll talk about briefly.
Do you rotate them at all, or just can you grow them in the same spot?
That would be another problem of the perennial bed. Like, again, we rotate potatoes for good crop rotation. And this is a clonally reproduced plant that could have viral buildup problems. So I think crop rotation on alocasia is a good idea. But again, I have a bed of 4-year-old that I obviously rotated. Another variety picture. Well, we started doing variety trials on this one, so we're up to about 8 different varieties now. Two main things that we've noticed in terms of the varieties, kind of Polynesian origin ones, like Hawaii, Caribbean origin varieties, seem to produce much bigger central mothers and less small eddos. We get these big pieces like this, which is good for some cooking things, and they don't seem to store as well. And then there's a whole set that we kind of think of as more like temperate Asian taros that tend to produce much smaller mothers, a higher number of small eddos around the outside, like lots of egg-sized eddos. They're the ones that seem to be a little more cold hardy, and they store really well. They stay really firm in storage. So we're kind of leaning more towards those kind of like Asian temperate ones. A lot of them will be Korean, Japanese, these types of taros. The one that you have is Korean taro and fits into that more temperate one. So you're not going to get huge mothers, but you'll get lots of these smaller eddos, which can be planted and eaten as you please. Just wanted to reference a bit more of our food exploration. The Hop this last year did a taro ice cream as a special. So like finding ways to fit this into the food system is really important to us. anything you can do with a potato, you can do with taro. So you can mash it, you can chip it, you can fry it, you can bake it. With Amanda Wilson, a Burmese chef, has done an incredible taro chicken stew for us, taro fritters, everything. And this is a taro ice cream, and it was very, very creamy, and seems to go down pretty well. So just finding ways for this staple crop to fit into our temperate food system. Okay. I didn't talk about the leaves. So very quickly on the leaves. In some countries, the leaves are the primary crop. So like Ghana, the leaves are eaten very heavily. And I've had a few Ghanaian chefs come through that really liked the leaves. There's a dish called inkantamari, which uses the leaves with like tomatoes and peanuts and makes this just real delicious leaf stew. So the leaves are definitely a viable crop. Also needs to be cooked. That's really important. If you eat it raw or undercooked, you'll get that same calcium oxalate issue. But they're a thick, leafy, like holds up well in a stew and has a really good silky texture and nice flavor. So I think the leaves are a good crop. The stems also can be cooked. We had one Ghanaian chef, Zoe Ajonio, came and stayed with us. She made me peel all the stems, which I found very laborious. These stems are only about this big and I had to peel every single one. So I generally don't cook the stems, but they are edible and used in some food cultures. And then some varieties of taro are known for their stem production, and you get much fatter stems. And so those I could imagine being worth peeling. The ones I was working with were tiny. So yeah, leaf and root production potential on this crop as well. Quick clarifying questions on taro. I do want to get through these last two. Yes?
Do you mind comparing it to cassava? Good cassava, I know, where I lived in Africa, and they would soak it for a few days to get out something, I don't remember what it was.
Yeah.
And then it would wind up being kind of fermented, and it was like an acquired taste. It was kind of funky, but it worked.
Yeah. No, this is much closer to a potato than that cassava preparation. No funkiness. Okay, what has leaves like spinach, shoots like asparagus, fruit reminiscent of summer squash, and large nutty seeds and potato-like tubers? And no, it's not allowed to answer. A platypus? No one said that before. Did anyone, I might try to hold this up, did anyone recognize this?
I grew it last year.
Not arrowroot?
It requires a very long growing season.
Does require like a make it last in the fall. It's not, this isn't in its form that you would recognize it if you recognize it at all. So chayote, again, is another one of our top crops. This is the first crop I've shared that isn't a root crop. So you're actually seeing the fruit of a Cucurbitaceae plant family crop. So related to all our other squashes and used and eaten much like those squash. It actually fits a real nice window where like most summer squash are kind of pooping out and winter squash haven't quite come in yet or matured. And these kind of harvest windows like August and September, they hold up well against all the common pests, which is nice. So we're not seeing vine mower damage on these, very little Mexican squash beetle damage on these. And most of the mildews and stuff don't seem to be hitting them too hard. So for now, we feel pretty good about that aspect of it. We grow no spray, so if they're producing in our system, then most folks are pretty good. The quick interesting thing with these is, I get a lot of people, when they see that we're growing chayote, tell me that they've gone to the store and bought a chayote and tried to grow it, and it's sprouted and grown these big, lush, beautiful vines that have taken over the trellis, which they tend to do. They're like vigorously vining, and that they've not produced like a single fruit. And so this is a classic example of a day-length trigger on flowering. And most chayote tropical. There's a whole category of chayote from Louisiana, the Mulaton, and there's a whole heirloom Mulaton project from that region. But they all have this day-length trigger that in southern Louisiana, they grow chayote and it fruits in kind of like December is their chayote window, which obviously doesn't work for us. We got some planting stock from a Hmong family that had been growing it in the region for decades, and that's like one of just a couple of varieties that we found that actually work for us. And even then, it always is a little bit late. It's like, are you gonna fruit? Are you gonna fruit? Are you gonna fruit? And then like mid-August, we start seeing little baby flowers, and we get a good flush in September, and it's always worth it. We get a good enough production that it's worth it, but it always feels a little bit close. So we're always on the hunt for more genetics that have are more leaning day-length neutral, and yeah, so that's where we're at. We do have more hope that this will regionally adapt over time because it is sexual propagation, so there is genetic recombination each year. And in this crate, and you can have a look afterwards, it's the same theory. We just bedded up these chayote. Each fruit, that's the flower and the mature fruit. That picture. Each fruit just has a single seed in it. So it's a little hard to ramp up. Like the yacon is perfect because we have a big storage tube that we eat, and we have a bunch of propagation material. So each plant like exponentially produces more plants. The chayote produces a lot of fruit, but if we want to eat any of them, we're basically sacrificing the seed because there's just one seed in each fruit. So it's a little harder to share out. You can imagine a seed packet would have to be like this big for each of these. So the thing we're experimenting with these is saving back a few fruit, having them vine early on, and then rooting out cuttings. So they do root fairly easily. A lot of the cucurbitaceae vines will root from their nodes, and then we can share rooted cuttings to kind of increase the ability to get these out into the world. Fairly neutral flavor. It's used as a baby weaning food in Mexico, where it's indigenous. But yeah, good, easy to grow. Oh, and because of that first quote, it's worth reiterating. You can eat the leaves, you can eat the tendrils. The Lee Family Fortune Farm comes to market with bunches of the tendrils. So even though it doesn't produce a fruit crop until the end of August, beginning of September, for 2 months prior to that, you can be harvesting the tendrils, the vining tendrils, and selling that as a green. And then if it perennializes, you also get a root crop. We've seen the roots, but it's like this big, and I tried eating it and it wasn't worth it. But if you look up like Mexican chayote root harvest, then you'll find videos of like 10-year-old patches of chayote where they've just taken over a whole hillside, and they go in there and dig out these like enormous roots, which apparently taste like potatoes. But I have not experienced that.
Question.
Yeah.
Is there a source for starts?
Good question. No. Sadly not. My hope is, it might not be this year, but my hope is by next year we'll have a distribution channel in place for this variety. I'm going to try and root out a lot of these, and we've field planned for 100 row feet this year of chayote. So sometimes we're in maintenance mode where we'll just grow like 20 row feet. This year we're doing a big amount of it. If we get a good harvest, then next year we'll be able to like do hundreds of flats and then sell plants in the spring. So hopefully next year, but we haven't quite worked that one out yet. Okay, Achira. Achira is an interesting one. I wanted to give you a quick sample of this. Lost all my plates. I'll just hand this around.
Chris, are you able to keep the chayote alive outside, or do you have to dig it and bring it in every year?
Yes, you have to dig it. It definitely frost sensitive. I'm going to pass this around. This is a arrowroot, but I will tell you that I don't think it tastes very good. It doesn't taste bad, but it just doesn't really taste of anything. And so this has been a curious one for me. Let me also pass this around. This is the root. Actually, this is part of the root. One of the amazing things with this crop is that it grows like huge amounts of underground, or like rhizomatic material. It's like really, really heavy yielding. It's kind of edgeless, and the cannas that you see growing all over as landscaping plants are kind of indica. So it's very closely related to those plants and looks similar. You know, it's the same type of plant structure. grows these beautiful big plants. You could grow this as a landscaping plant. That's my same Zoe down here. So yeah, just very, very beautiful plants. Huge amount of underground material. So there's a lot going here. That it's easy to grow, it's highly productive, it's absolutely beautiful in the field. But you get this like big, chunky, fibrous root crop that doesn't taste so much and wonder what to do with it. Like, how am I going to persuade people to actually consume this thing? So the agronomic side of things is very easy on this. Stores without even thinking about it, all that kind of stuff. But the culinary side has always stumped me. It's used, like, it's been called Queensland arrowroot because for a long time in Australia, it was the primary crop for starch production. And there's a history of using it for like glass noodles and that type of thing. So extracting it as a starch product. It's actually got one of the largest starch molecules of any plant that's grown. So it's very good for that. I'm not successfully persuading many local people to start a local starch industry. It's not very sexy. With that one not working, I've kind of just been in this holding pattern with Achira. And then just earlier this year, I found some I forget what the name was, but I found the Chinese name for this, and they were using it in interesting ways. One thing they were doing was planting it very dense and harvesting the shoot, which I didn't even know you could do, but about this age here, they were harvesting the shoots and using that in a stir fry. I'm thinking like hosta shoots type of world here. So that's one thing we're going to try this year is grow a real dense patch of it and harvest shoots. And the other thing they were doing, which I thought might be even more potential, is they weren't waiting until it got huge and mature. A couple of months into growing, they were going in with a spade and just slicing off the outside of the plant. And so they were just getting these like tender nubbins and using them as food. And I wonder if they have a different flavor profile or a different texture and it could work better. And they were leaving the whole plant alive and just slicing off this outer harvest and letting that grow. So I've got a few new experiments to try this year to see what it does as we try and find a place for it in the food system.
I know I've boiled some and it tenderized fairly well. It had a sweet corn flavor. I don't know if older portions are more fibrous or...
Yeah, we have had one chef boil it for a long time and then turn it into a creamer. That was actually a really tasty thing she did with it. So I agree. I think there's potential here. We just haven't fully landed on it ourselves. But yeah, boiling could work.
Yeah, for as tough as it was cutting it, it's soft. I was surprised.
That's what when I tasted this crema, I was like, how? Like, because there was no fiber in it at all, and I'd given her some really nasty big ones, and she said she just cooked it for a long time. So yeah, community experimentation. I'm all about it. So propagation material is the same as the eating material, and you can see from that piece I passed around that you can even see the shoots starting to come up off that planting material. But you only need to put like one of those shoots in for a new plant. That's all I've got on that one. Oh, the other thing I want to say on this is, and again, I don't want to go too deep into genetics, but this one here has flowered for us but never produced a seed. So it flowers, produces a pod, and the pod is empty, suggesting that it's sterile, which suggests that it's a tetraploid. So it's got like mixed up genetics. We've also got one that is diploid, which doesn't get as tall but abundantly flowers and produces viable seed in a single season. So we've got one population we're growing from seed and one that we have to grow from clones because it doesn't produce a viable seed. The one that grows from seed doesn't produce it's like smaller tubers. So this one produces huge tubers and the seed one doesn't. So we're kind of just playing around with it, and my thought this year is the seed production one is the one I'm going to do for shoot production, because we're starting a full flat, so we'll have 72 plants, and I'm going to plant them in a real tight block and just force a whole bunch of tender shoots to come up and use them as a leaf harvest. So if that's a viable method, then that's one farming option, while using these ones for root production. So still experimenting. This one, a bunch of things get called arrowroot. This one gets called Queensland's arrowroot. This is kind of like the true arrowroot, which again I'll quickly pass around. This has already had all its skin. This is actually ready for food production. I'll pass it around and you can talk about it. But you will see that it's also starting to sprout. So you could plant that and it would grow, but we're planning to eat it. This is what it looks like when it comes out of the ground, and then we've kind of peeled off that roughage on the outside. And what we're actually going to do with this is we'll grate it, and then we'll dehydrate it, and then we'll put that in a blender and pulverize it into a flour, and it becomes a real kind of pretty flavorful gluten-free flour. A lot of gluten-free friends have used this flour and commented how much they like it in their mix. So it's got potential there. It's primarily known as a starch production thing again, but again, we're not too interested in the starches, but as a flour, just grinding the whole thing, then it seems to work pretty well. Chef Shorty of Bun Intended made a arrowroot and ube cookie for us last year. That was like the favorite thing at the event. It was just really, really good cookie. It was gluten-free and vegan, I think. So I like growing the arrowroot, although it's kind of in the same realm as the achira. It's just finding out where it can fit in and whether it can be agronomic. That's the cookie.
Do you know if anybody's tried pie crust?
I don't know if anybody has.
So fibrous, if you just cook it, is it fibrous like the achira?
Yeah. So mainly flowers. It's 3 o'clock. I want to quickly talk about the ube because that's my last crop, and then I want to do the green. So I'll wrap it up within 5 minutes. This is a slide to remind me that I think it's stupid that we eat kale in August, and there's so many different edible greens out there that don't get the same pest and disease pressure as some of the brassicas and other things that we try and grow in the heat of August, that I think we could lean into some of this. So this is like an easy way to incorporate diversity, in my opinion. And to kind of like really highlight that, I've got this book that some of you may have seen before, but I really like it, called Edible Leaves of the Tropics. And the crazy thing with this book that just always gobsmacks me every time I pull it out is it's got kind of like profiles in it of different plants. It is tropical plants, but a lot of them you can grow here or are known here. But the thing that really amazes me is that this is an appendix at the end, and I know you can't read this because it's so small, but this is one column and this is another column that lists all the species names, and every single one of them is a different species with an edible green. So 2 columns of information, so just a ton of different options to go at, and then it just keeps going. Just like this, thinking about those 6,000 different edible species, there must be like at least 1,000 listed right here of all these different crops that have edible greens. And again, a lot of them are like known crops. There's like tomatoes and peppers and things like that with edible greens that we just don't generally eat. This is where chaya comes into it, and moringa and southern peas and a lot of the other legumes. So just like a huge amount of food potential for greens that want to grow in the heat of summer instead of trying to modify the environment to make things that don't want to grow. So that's just a selection of some of the tropical greens that we've worked with: taro greens, okra greens, some hibiscus, squash greens, chayote, sweet potato greens, southern pea greens, moringa. This is molokia. Just there's like that's a whole world in presentation in itself. It's like edible greens of the tropics. So just inviting some curiosity there. And then the last thing, I don't have slides for this one, but I did promise I would talk about the ube a little bit more. The reason it's not in those sets of slides is because for the longest time it wasn't in my success stories section. Not because we couldn't grow it, we've successfully grown this for a long time. It was the propagation question was always the problem, because not only are we struggling to work out how to get it to sprout on a schedule, we also don't know where it'll sprout from. It'll generally, we do know it'll send one out from here, but we've also like had it randomly come out from here, or it just does random things. So like with a potato, you can look at it and you can see where the eyes are going to sprout and cut it into sections, and one potato could become 4 bits of planting material. But when we look at this, we could just cut off this end piece and say, okay, that's my planting material. But then for a plant that really just produces 1 or 2 big chunks of edible material, it's not really increasing my propagation material, right? I'm getting 1 piece of propagation material from 1 plant. And so I can never get to a point where I can share this out because I'm always just getting what I planted. Or I sacrifice eating it because I don't know where more sprouts are going to come out from. The perfect world would be I chop that off and I eat all of that, and that this gives me multiple sprouts, but that's not what happens. Like this sweet potato, it's all coming out of one end. I could actually eat the rest of the sweet potato. So that's not happening on a schedule. Like I say, it's like a cat. It doesn't care what I think. So yes, it's been a struggle, even though it's productive. And actually, this is a deep purple root all the way through. This is ube flower I'm going to pass around. This is a crop of the Philippines. Every time I post a picture of ube on Instagram, it feels like every Filipino baker in America sends me a message telling me that they'll buy everything I can grow. And I'm always having to apologize to say, I don't have shareable quantities at this point. So anyway, I kept on running into these issues. This last year I was at NC State where they were starting to work with a related yam species, and they had a yam vine cutting protocol. I had tried rooting out vine cuttings before because this does grow this big long vine, and I had like a 1% success rate. I did 100 cuttings and maybe got 1 to root out, so I didn't feel like it was working. They sent me like a 5-page academic document listing out like humidity levels and temperature levels and a whole protocol, which they said they had great success with on a related species. So I followed that protocol this year, and I'm attempting to root out cuttings, but that would like radically change everything, right? If I could go from taking a couple of yams that give me a long vine and turns into 50 plants, then I could give every one of you a plant. At the moment, I only have this, and I'm like, it's mine, and I'm keeping it. So that's the position I'm in right now. If this rooting, it was a single node rooting, and actually I've already done it. You can see I chopped off the top one, but every single node has the potential to both root out and shoot. And you can see, since I've done the termination, then this side shoot is already shooting out. If this was under soil, then technically, I'm led to believe, it will be rooting out too. So I'd get that shoot coming above the soil, and it would root below the soil, and then I'd have a new plant. So that's what we're going for this year, which would, like I say, change everything. I would love this to be successful because it's just tasty and productive and all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
So purple sweet potato is different than ube?
Very, yeah. Maybe similar culinary uses, but completely different plant family.
So have you tried planting that to see if it shoots up slips like the sweet potato, or it just doesn't? Obviously not, or you would know that.
Yeah. You sometimes get 1 or 2 coming out if you bury the whole thing under soil, but you don't get mega slipping like a sweet potato. So yeah, that's ube. So we're kind of working on, but feel closer. I feel, and again, cassava wasn't in these slides, and I feel like someone brought up cassava, so I feel like I should very briefly mention that, and then I will stop. Cassava is an easy one to say. It's the biggest disappointment. It's delicious. You can cook it without it being funky. It can be real creamy. We had a Salvadorian chef make like yuca fritters that are just like so good. So I would love to be successful with cassava. It's from stem cuttings, so we've had stem cuttings come up from Florida. We've planted them. They've grown these huge, enormous, productive plants. I've done this 3 years running, and every year I see these plants and go, you cannot possibly have a plant so big and lush and green and not be producing cassava underground. So again, I'm optimistic by nature, and every year my heart is dashed because I dig up these plants and like smaller than my finger in width cassava roots coming out. And it just doesn't, it's like that plant is huge and beautiful and big. And again, obviously it's a day length trigger issue that maybe if I had another month or 6 weeks, then there'd be enough time for that root formation to happen. But in our growing season, I give it till frost, I dig up the plant and I get tiny, tiny cassava roots. for all that big plant material.
You know way more about this than I do, but is there more fertility in the soil? Because when I lived in Africa, the soil was really not good.
I wouldn't say I've got the best fertility in the world by any means, but the reason I know it's not that is because Yana also can't grow it. If anybody could grow successful cassava, then it would be Yana, and her soil she's been on the same place for 30 years and it's just paradise, and she has the same problems as I do. So
What I'm saying is maybe too fertile.
Oh, too fertile?
Yeah.
Oh, in that case, I would have great production. So, so no, I don't think, it could be. There could be a micronutrient type thing that's missing. I think it's more likely to be the daylight sensitivity.
Because it does grow in Florida.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And it's generally poor soil in Florida.
Sandy and
but more sun.
Yeah.
Of course.
I think it's the length of the season. I truly think that's what it comes down to. So either we need to find a variety that will produce in a different day length, or there needs to be some serious breeding work done on it. So that's where we are with cassava. So I'm gonna wrap it up with cassava. We've kind of, I hope it's all right with everyone. We've done tangential questions all the way through, so I don't really have time for questions right now. But I've given you all a card, and that will give you access to our website and being in touch with us. So you're always welcome to reach out with questions. As we continue this work, we're on social media, and you can follow along there. And then the thing I definitely want to tell you about is not this Saturday, but the Saturday after, this April 27th, is our first trial the table of the year. And I wasn't clear, but I've referenced these chef events a few times. We basically get 4 or 5 chefs come together, we give them a pantry list of stuff we're working with from the Utopian Seed Project. So they've actually got access to a lot of these storage crops at the moment. They produce 2 small plates each, so you end up with like 8 to 10 small plates to sample for the event. We've got other things going on, like there's a squash butchering demo, and there's some tastings and that kind of thing. It's out at Hickory Nut Gap. They're really fun events. We've got sliding scale to make them as accessible as possible. And if you're interested, then there's a link on that card, and we'd love to see you there. That's me.